Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Taylor. I'm the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education here at VMFA, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. It's a lecture and book signing on Ansel Adams with Rebecca Senth. It's my duty to introduce Chris Oliver, who will be introducing Becky. So Chris is the Bev Perdue Jennings Assistant Curator of American Art. He's been at VMFA since 2013. He got his PhD and MA at the University of Virginia and his BA at the University of Richmond. And in his time, in short time, he's done many projects at the museum. You probably saw his Natural Bridge show, which was called Virginia Arcadia, and had more than 60,000 visitors during the pandemic, so really incredible. And up right now is his Ansel Adams show, which runs through January 2nd. So if you've seen it, you have to go see it again, because there's lots to look at and discover, including his music, which I'm really enjoying. And then if you haven't seen it, do try and see it. You could go tonight. It's a good night to go see it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to begin our evening. I hope you enjoy it and get your book signed.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As Michael mentioned, we're here tonight to hear from Dr. Rebecca Senth, who will speak on the lecture title that you see in front of you. And then immediately following the lecture, directly straight across out the back doors from the theater, we'll have a book signing for her recently published book. So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Senth, who is the Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona in Tucson. She has a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Arizona and a master's and PhD from Boston University. In 2012, her book, Reconstructing the View, The Grand Canyon Photographs of Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe, was released by the University of California Press. In 2017, her book, To Be 13, showcasing the work of Betsy Schneider, was published by Radius Press and the Phoenix Art Museum. Senf, though, is a longtime Ansel Adams scholar and recently published this book on Ansel Adams' early years, Making a Photographer, which was co-published by the Center for Creative Photography and Yale. So with that, I will ask everyone to welcome Becky Senf to the stage.
All right. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. I'm only recently back to doing in-person talks after a long time of doing Zoom talks, and it's so much nicer to be here in person and to be able to talk with you all and know that you're there and know that you're following and know that you'll have questions. So let's get started. Tonight I'm going to talk about my book, but I'm also going to make a number of links to the excellent exhibition that you have upstairs. I had the opportunity to see the show earlier today. The pairings in the exhibition are really fascinating, so if you haven't been up to look at those, I would spend some time, look at the way in which Ansel Adams printed things differently between the two different prints. There are actually pretty significant cropping differences between the prints where there are pairings, so really interesting stuff to look at. And then I'll get into some of the other prints that I think are especially nice in the exhibition as we go through the talk tonight. So I'm going to, at the beginning and end, read from the book, little excerpts to give you a sense of what the book sounds like and some of the book's content. But in the middle part, I'll just talk about the book and about things from your exhibition here. So to get started, oh, I have to turn this on. All right, there we go. So this is the book that was published last year. It was published February 18, 2020. So we got it out just ahead of the pandemic, but then from there it was pretty much all talks on Zoom. And this book represents about 17 years worth of work. I began research on Ansel Adams in 2003 when I worked at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, as part of an exhibition that we did there that opened in 2005 on the Ansel Adams Lane collection, which was at that time the largest private collection of Ansel Adams. And then following the opening of the show in 2005, I continued my work on Ansel Adams for my doctoral dissertation, which was submitted in 2007. And then over the period between 2007 and 2020, I revised the book, and it was published last year. And the basic premise of the book is, how did Ansel Adams get from making pictures that look like the one on the left, which was made around 1920 of trees, to pictures that look like the one on the right, which Ansel Adams made in northern New Mexico in 1958. We, in the business, call this horizontal aspens to differentiate it from vertical aspens, which he made the same day in northern New Mexico. And so the picture that's on the right is the one that looks like you're used to seeing Ansel Adams. It has all those familiar hallmarks of Ansel Adams's style. Lots of contrast, dramatic lighting, a kind of sweep of the landscape, whereas the picture on the left, this earlier picture, is very intimate, it's very close up, it's low contrast, it has a kind of intimacy and very subtle detail that the later picture doesn't have. And so I wanted to understand, how did he get from making pictures like the one on the left to making pictures like the one on the right? And so one of the things that I had to do in order to frame the book was to define what that Ansel Adams style is, that mature style or signature style that we recognize. I'm sure everyone in here could see a new picture by Ansel Adams and would recognize it as an Ansel Adams picture. And interestingly, nobody had ever written what those characteristics were that define Ansel Adams's style. So that was something that I needed to do. And so this is where I am going to read a little bit from the book, but I want to give you a summary of what I'm going to talk about so you can follow along. So in defining Ansel Adams' signature style, there were a number of characteristics that seemed important. One is that he's trying to heroize the landscape and emotionally engage us so that he can convey his ideas about what's so important about the wilderness. So he's really trying to pull us in emotionally and persuade us. He's wants to get us invested in this idea of the transformational possibilities of wilderness and of nature. And so to do that, he uses certain characters in his photographs. One of them is this panoramic sweep, so that we're seeing a large swath of the landscape. Another is that he's using an omniscient point of view, so it's that godlike perspective that conveys that this is the best view of this particular scene. Another is the use of dramatic light and weather effects to give the picture more drama. And then finally, and especially for those of you photographers in the audience, he uses this wide range of gray tones, including a strong use of contrast. And those of you who are photographers may know of this as the zone system. So this is a way in which he creates this broad range of gray tones. And he uses all of this to create drama and to evoke awe and to really get us invested. So from here, I'll read a little bit about this picture. Using the Tetons and the Snake River as an example, it is possible to describe these stylistic elements that Adams brought together to support his communicative goal. This photograph visually expresses the transformative potential of experiences in nature and the value of wilderness as an intrinsic good. In sum, it presents a heroic vision of the American wilderness as an invaluable asset to its citizens. Adams chose a vantage point that facilitated a panoramic view of the Teton Mountain Range with the winding Snake River. The picture includes a swath of cloud-filled sky and distant mountains with patches of bright snow. In the mid-range, the Silvery River curves through tree-covered banks. With little immediate foreground, Adams created a perspective that suggested his omniscient grasp of the scene and as such implies that what is presented is made from the ideal position and is the best, or perhaps the only, way that this particular vista should be seen. It is a stylistic choice that imparts authority and gravity to the picture and confers importance on the subject. Adams favored landscape views that featured visible weather, such as snowstorms, billowing clouds, and rain. In some instances, his photographs include a wide band of sky to accommodate clouds, emphasizing an atmospheric expanse. In other cases, clouds and mist appear around landforms, creating depth within the three-dimensional space and helping to define the shape and appearance of the land itself, as with this image, Clearing Winter Storm, which is in the exhibition upstairs. One advantage of weather for Adams was its ephemeral nature. Clouds, rain, and snow are all temporal elements, and they impart a sense of transience and motion to Adams's necessarily still frames. In the Tetons and the Snake River, the sky glows behind dark storm clouds, and the left-hand portion of the mountains is bathed in sunlight, as is the surface of the Snake River, causing it to shimmer within the darker surrounding territory. Because of the changeability of the light and weather depicted, the viewer is aware that the scene Adams captured must not have looked like this for long, and indeed will never look exactly like this again. Thus, the viewer can both appreciate the magical qualities of the spectacular clouds and illuminating rays as inspiring features of the natural world, and also attribute to Adams the ability to perceive and record just the right moment when the scene offered this exquisite combination of visual effects. A key component of Adams's mature style is an operatic treatment of his subject, a desire to heighten the dramatic qualities of the scene and create a photographic work of art that is both widely comprehensible and spectacular. In some instances, it is achieved by his use of viewpoint. At other times, it is light or weather effects that convey that engaging sense of drama. In some pictures, such as the Tetons and the Snake River, it is the use of powerful shifts in contrast, glittering passages of light interspersed with or appearing alongside areas of dense shadow or darkness. Adams's use of heightened contrast gives his images an engaging forcefulness, making his artworks bold and serious. The perception that the landscape is imbued with drama creates an expectation that the situation is not static, and that viewers are observing a fleeting moment within an evolving situation. Adams's use of operatic and awe-inspiring qualities in his prints plays upon the expectations of viewers. The Tetons and the Snake River, as a work of photographic art, is impactful because the actual scene, when observed by a typical national park tourist, does not look as it does in Adams's picture. His complete set of skills in making the negative and the print coalesce to create an artwork that surpasses people's real-life experience, presenting an idealized, heroic version of what really exists, but one still rooted in the appearance of the scene. In so doing, Adams's artworks convey not what he saw, but what he felt. Perhaps more importantly, they convey what Adams hoped his viewers would feel when faced with these landscapes that were deeply meaningful and inspiring to him. So we're going to go back to when Adams was a boy. This is Adams as a 14-year-old in 1916, when his family very first went to Yosemite Valley. He had been gifted Hutchings' book about the Sierra Nevada and the discovery of Yosemite by white adventurers, and he wanted to go see the place for himself. And so his doting parents, he was an only child, agreed to take him to Yosemite. And so he went and had this incredible experience. And at the Center for Creative Photography, where I work and where the Ansel Adams Archive lives, we have the album that Adams made of the photographs he took on that very first trip. So this is his childhood album of Yosemite photographs. And in it are a group of little snapshots. These were made with the Box Brownie camera. They were developed in the photo finisher right in Yosemite Valley, so they're little drugstore prints, essentially. But the way they're arranged in the album gives us something of a starting point for understanding Adams's career. Rather than organizing them chronologically, the way the trip happened, he grouped pictures according to different geological sites in the valley. So here you can see we're seeing 5 different pictures, all of Half Dome. There's another page with 5 more pictures, all of Half Dome. They're right together in the book. And the book is arranged essentially from west to east, featuring different elements, waterfalls and rocks and sites within the valley. And so we understand that he's organizing things very intentionally, but we can also see, even in just this group of 5 pictures, he's experimenting photographically. He's moving where Half Dome falls within the composition. You can see in the picture in the middle, he's experimenting with backlighting rather than light coming onto Half Dome. So we already see him beginning to think about what he can do with the camera and what kind of control he has about how the subject looks. But mostly that first trip was Adams as a tourist. He's just a boy, he's learning about Yosemite, he's experimenting and exploring. And I want to read a little bit of this letter that Adams wrote. It's in the archive at the CCP where I work. He's writing to his Aunt Mary. She's the one who gave him the Hutchings book. And he's telling her about his trip. So I'm going to start at that second paragraph on the first page. A couple of days ago, we went to Mirror Lake to see the sunrise. We then took the North Dome Trail up the Tenaya Canyon. It is a 21-mile trail, and we had the pleasure of walking about 1/4 of it. About 4 or 5 days ago, I went to the top of Yosemite Falls and Yosemite Point. I came back on fast time, covering 5 miles in 1 hour and 4 minutes. I have taken more than 85 good pictures. I have learned to swim and play pool and croquet. We expect to go to Glacier Point on Wednesday, either by the 11-mile trail or the ledge trail. We will go on the former on horses. Hoping that you are well and expecting to hear from you soon, I am Ansel Adams. Very sweet, right? 14-year-old boy writing to his aunt. But it gives us a sense of how he was experiencing things. You know, there's a lot trail in this much time, I've made this many good pictures, I'm learning new activities, but he's really having a tourist experience. What's great then is that we begin to see him change in his relationship to Yosemite. So from that very first trip as a 14-year-old, Ansel Adams came to Yosemite Valley every year of his life for the rest of his life. And over the next 10 years in particular, we see his relationship to the place change very dramatically. He gets interested in backpacking and extended camping trips. He meets with all kinds of mentors. Some of them are Sierra Club mentors, some are just folks he meets in the valley, and they teach him a new way of relating to the landscape. He learns ornithology and geology and botany and astronomy, and it's a slower, more scholarly, more thoughtful way of moving through the terrain. He learns about geography and the names and how things came to be the way they are. And in this picture, we see him with Mistletoe the mule. And what he's got on Mistletoe is his camera equipment. In this era, Ansel Adams is still working with glass plate negatives. So he's literally backpacking with a huge camera and sheets of glass that are the negatives that he's recording the pictures on. So in order to do an extended trip, he really needs the mule. There's a great letter where he writes to his dad about Mistletoe and says, "As I said before, he will be indispensable when long trips are considered, and we will then be able to pack a more enjoyable amount and variety of provisions and take greater pleasure out of our meals, more milk, more canned fruit, more everything than if we packed on our backs." So he's getting this deeper connection to being in the landscape, being in the wilderness. He's up in the high country outside of Yosemite Valley in the Sierra Nevada, where really it's only the very committed hikers and campers that are out in this wilderness terrain. As he's learning this kind of deeper connection to the place and making much more sophisticated photographs than those original pictures, he's approached by Albert Bender, and this is a portrait of Albert Bender by Consuela Kanaga. Albert Bender was an arts patron in San Francisco, where Adams lived with his parents. And Albert Bender offered to help Adams create an art portfolio. This was 1927. Adams hadn't really been selling his photographs very much. And Bender said, why don't we put together a portfolio of prints? I'll call all of my friends and ask them to buy copies. And that will allow you to create this art product that you can distribute and test your will in this new art market. So Adams did that and created the Permeant Prints portfolio. And there are 6 of the Permeant Prints up in the gallery, and then another little bitty print of the lodgepole pines, which is a very special object. That image was in the Permeant Prints, but you've got a special print of it that Adams made separate from the portfolio. But this image, Kearsarge Pinnacles, is a good example of what that Permeant Prints portfolio looked like. What we're seeing here is still early Ansel Adams, so we don't have the contrast, we don't have that panoramic sweep. What we have is a much more modernist engagement with the landscape. He's as interested in the shapes and the forms and the lines and the way that things overlap and create patterns as he is in just describing the place or the space. So this kind of echoing of the tree all the way on the left, the way it echoes the shape of the mountain on the right, and the play of the trees in the foreground with the mountain range in the background are as interesting to him as telling you about this particular lake in the mountains. So this Permeant Prints portfolio, Adams didn't yet have any sense of who his audience was or what they might be interested in. So he basically just made pictures of the places he knew and loved, and they were very much in the style that he was doing at the time. The Permeant Prints portfolio is printed on an uncoated translucent paper, and this image is designed to show you what that paper looks like when it's not matted and framed. You can see that it's curling up at the edges, and I overlapped it with the colophon so that you could see just how translucent it is. You can see that opaque paper through the print because it's so translucent. The prints are actually packaged in paper folders in the portfolio so that if you bought this back in 1927, you'd handle it, you'd open the paper folder, and then you'd lift out the print, which would allow light to come in from behind. And it really transforms the pictures when you see them that way. I think I have another image that shows, this is me holding one of the prints up. So you can see that when light floods in from behind, it illuminates the picture, almost like you're seeing it on a light box. So it's a very dynamic and changeable experience from when it's flat in the paper folder to when you lift it up and hold it. And that play of the pictures moving from something more two-dimensional and pattern-like when it's flat to something more three-dimensional and a wider range of tones when it's lifted up is something that I think Adams must have appreciated about this paper. This is one of 2 pictures of Marion Lake. There are 2 pictures of Marion Lake in the portfolio, Permeant Prints portfolio. And part of how I learned about Adams's development and connection to nature in this period was through Joseph N. LeConte's journal. So researchers, we tend to think of journals especially as like the gold standard of archival documents. Journals tell us so much about people's experiences. And unfortunately, Ansel Adams was not a journalist. He didn't write in a diary. He didn't keep that kind of notes. The good news is Ansel Adams wrote tons and tons of correspondence, so that does give us a lot of insight. But I was able to look at Joseph N. LeConte's journals because Ansel Adams used to backpack with the LeConte family. So I was able to get a sense of what these trips were like. And in the mid-20s, when Adams was backpacking and camping with the LeContes. There are journals at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley that describe what those trips were like. For each day, LeConte would write just 3 or 4 lines talking about what they did, and that included certain details. So he would talk about the food. So for instance, he'd write about a wonderful pan of biscuits on return to camp. He'd write about the weather, including lightning, hail, rain, hot and sultry, overcast, perfect, clear, cold cutting wind, and one evening, a tremendous rainstorm that swept the head of Bubbs Creek and the most magnificent rainbow I have ever seen, spanning the West Vidette. He wrote about all their different activities, including loafing, fishing, washing, swimming, bathing, walking, climbing, tramping, resting, writing letters, packing, and botanizing. He'd write about the wildlife, which was mostly mosquitoes, but one time a bear. He'd write about the people that they were passing out along the trail, including one time when he said, met Smith of Standard Oil and party. He wrote about an earthquake. He wrote, quote, after we were all in bed, we had an earthquake, heard the roar from the east, then a sharp movement of earth under our beds, end quote. And then in the 1925 journal, in particular, he makes several mentions of times when Adams was off photographing, as on July 6th, quote, the 3 were off again for Kearsarge this cold, clear morning at 7. I simply loafed about and killed time till Helen and Joseph returned at 1. A perfect day, clear as a bell. Ansel stayed on pass to get proper lighting effects, end quote. So you can see how this journal gives me all kinds of rich detail that I didn't have about what those experiences were like. So this picture of Marion Lake is, as I said, one of 2. This is another picture of Marion Lake, also from the Permeant Prints portfolio. And Marion Lake was a place that was very special to Ansel Adams and even more special to Joseph N. LeConte, his mentor and hiking companion. In 1902, LeConte had named this glassy mountain lake for his wife, Helen Marion Gompertz LeConte, herself an avid hiker and climber. And in LeConte's diary for the summer of 1925, the year after his wife had died, the July 25th entry at Marion Lake reads, quote, got up late, and after a good breakfast, I went around on the west side of the lake and found a beautiful white granite rock bedded in the meadow grass near the shore of the lake. At the foot of this, Helen, his daughter, Joseph, his son, and I buried the box containing the ashes of my beloved wife. I then drilled the rock and started work on placing of the bronze tablet. In the afternoon, I finished the erection of the tablet and with Ansel's help, placed a flat boulder over the grave, end quote. So here Adams is memorializing the lake named for Helen and the place where they left her ashes to be in this really beautiful mountain spot. So in addition to having mentors like LeConte, Adams was also part of the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club of this time, the 19-teens and 20s, was a very different Sierra Club than we imagine today. This international political action committee that it is very different from the hiking club that it was. So here we're seeing a picture from 1902. Part of what the Sierra Club did in order to build its membership and to create a stronger membership was to do these summer outings, which were multi-week trips in the wilderness with parties as large as 200 people. Can you imagine going on a 4-week camping trip with 200 other people in the summer in the Sierra Nevada? But that's what they did. Here you can see them at camp and they're dining. These were very lavish camping trips. You did have to rough it. You slept on the ground. You had to, if you had a tent, you had to set it up yourself. But they brought these incredible Klondike stoves on mules, and there was a commissary that created the meals for each evening and each morning. So there were hot meals out in the wilderness for this party of 200. And Ansel Adams really cherished that communal aspect. As an only child, his connection to the Sierra Club was really important to him. And I think this is such a beautiful quote. This is Ansel Adams writing about the campfire. As the cool wings of night fold on the mountains, the campfire eats ravenously into the dark, and you come with the others to sit on log or rock or stretch out on the earth and give happy attention to the affairs of the clan, which he wrote in 1932. So in the early years of the Sierra Club, when they would do these summer outings, they would build campfires, and in some cases, they would build 2 campfires so that there was a stage between the 2 campfires, and they would use that stage each night for lectures from scholars who were on the trip. Some of the musicians would bring their instruments and they would play. There would be sing-alongs. And then there was also a theatrical. And Ansel Adams was involved in the theatrical. This is the cast of one of the theatrical performances. That's Ansel Adams in the foreground, kneeling, holding the lyre. And this is actually in the 1930s. He was hired in 1928 to become the official photographer of the Sierra Club outings, but this is a later year. And this year, not only did he perform in the theatrical, he wrote the theatrical. It was a mock Greek tragedy called Exhaustos, in which King Dihydros spars with his archenemy Rycrispos of Pucha, while the traitorous Princess Clymenextra aids her father's nemesis. And so during the first act, the narrator, who was played by Ansel Adams himself and christened Spirit of the Itinerary, proclaimed, quote, "From 4 in the morning till 10 every night, the life of Dihydros is devoid of delight. Rycrispos is threatening, the queen gives abuse, his daughter's a traitor, his son's of no use. Oh, hard is the life of Dihydros the mighty. Among other things, he's forgotten his nighty." So Adams creates all of this wonderful wordplay. The king's mule Pegasus was last seen headed towards Modestos, which is a pun on the California Central Valley town of Modesto, and woven references to the Sierra Club. Rycrispos's army was detected among the willows by the flash of cup and spoon, items that Sierra Club members carried like badges of honor, and all of this while creating a plot. So this is Adams really invested in the social life of the Sierra Club. And so he was there as official photographer, documenting things like the theatrical, but then also taking pictures of all of the landscape that they saw along the way. This is Ansel Adams with his Sierra Club cup on his belt to give you a sense of what he looks like. I just love that your exhibition upstairs has 2 portraits of Ansel Adams. I actually find that these portraits of Ansel Adams really help give me an understanding of him, contrasting the early portraits to later portraits. I wanted to show just a couple pages from the Sierra Club album that he does in 1928. This is the one that I focus on in my book, when the Sierra Club did their summer outing in the Canadian Rockies. And I'm interested here in the way in which he's combining and experimenting with his composition and really pulling on a bunch of threads that we're seeing in this moment. This is 1928. It lasts until 31 or 32. It's very specific to his early work. We don't see him continue it later on. But he's interested in a kind of asymmetry, a real minimalism, that are both qualities that we might associate with pictorialism, and then a modernism as well, an interest in form, interest in line and in shape, and in a flattening of the picture plane. So these 2 pictures of this line of hikers is much more about describing a picture than it is about describing the space or the experience, and I'm gonna give you a comparison to illustrate that. Or this one, too, where you really have a sense of the space as having been flattened. Those mountains appear above the hikers rather than beyond or behind the hikers. And To give you a sense of how that is true, I'm contrasting here Ansel Adams on the left with Josephine Zook Spates, who made a photograph, as you can see, in almost precisely the same location as Ansel Adams while they were doing this hike in the Canadian Rockies. But whereas Ansel Adams has disconnected the hikers from where he stands, Josephine Zook Spates shows you literally the ground, the rocks that she's standing on, and the way that where she's standing connects up to that row of hikers. Whereas Adams has abstracted the group of hikers, and you can see there's no horizon in Adams's picture. The snow goes right up to the top, which emphasizes that flattening of space. Whereas Josephine Zook Spates does give us a horizon. We can see the sky in the upper right corner. And so you have more of a sense of a progression, a depth of space. And interestingly, now I'm contrasting Ansel Adams's proof print on the left with his finished signed print on the right. Adams took a picture that's much more like the Josephine Zook Spates picture, where you see that trail of footsteps going from where he stands up to the hikers, but then he cropped way in to cut that off and to create that more abstract picture, more flattened picture that we see on the right-hand side. So these are Canadian Rockies pictures that Adams makes in 1928. Now I'm going to jump forward a little bit and talk about Ansel Adams's work for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. And this is work that Adams did on commission for the concession in Yosemite National Park. So they owned all the hotels, they owned all the restaurants, they owned all the outfitters. And so Adams was hired to create pictures of activities in the park that they could use to advertise and attract more tourists. So for instance, this picture he made on the right of golfing, this picture of the ice rink, and you can see part of his task was to show not just the activity, but the dramatic setting in which the activities were happening. And there was a huge emphasis on winter, because if you imagine that you are the owner of a hotel and your hotel is fully booked in the summer with Yosemite tourists, how are you going to make more money? You either have to build another hotel so that you can attract more people in the summer, or you try and fill those hotel rooms in the winter when they were otherwise vacant. So that was the real push in the early 1930s for Yosemite Park and Curry Company, was let's get more winter tourists to Yosemite and fill up those empty hotel rooms. So Adams is making pictures like this dog sled picture on the left, or the cross-country skiing picture on the right, or the pictures that you have upstairs in the exhibition, these incredible skiing and sleighing pictures. And these were unquestionably made as part of his work for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. Actually, the picture that we're looking at here on the left has a little typewritten label on the back that's advertising copy. So this picture would have gone out to a newspaper, and they could have run the picture with the little bit of advertising copy that's on the back about the magic and spectacularness of skiing in Yosemite National Park. At this time in the early 30s, it was all cross-country skiing and like downhill skiing on the little hills in and around the valley. I think the sleighing picture is just gorgeous, magical. There's all this snow spraying up. You've got to go up and look at it up close. These are two more ski pictures. I'm not a downhill skier. I find both of these pictures totally terrifying, but apparently people thought that this was a good idea to ski near these edges. The picture on the left is a landscape of a ski slope. On the right, a skier coming down with this very abstract set of tracks on the right. Or this picture, which I'm now going to liken to those pictures of hikers that we just saw from the Canadian Rockies. Very similar, right? No horizon line. Here we now have ski tracks that are this very abstract way of creating lines and shapes within the picture plane, very asymmetrical with this weighty figure at the bottom. I think these are such cool, really special pictures that your museum owns, and it's such an opportunity to get to see them. So if you've seen these pictures, go back up and look at them again. If you haven't seen them, this is like such a gem in this particular exhibition. Actually, I'm going to go back. I wanted to mention that Adams had an exhibition in 1931 at the Smithsonian Institution. He was written to in the fall of 1930, unsolicited. The curator there, A.J. Olmsted, wanted to know if Adams wanted to have a show. Adams writes back and says, I have pictures of the Sierra Nevada, I have pictures of Indian dances and Southwestern architecture, I have pictures of the Canadian Rockies, and I have, quote, stunning ski photographs taken in the Yosemite High Sierra, end quote. That's what you all have upstairs, are those stunning ski pictures. So really cool that those are here. Okay. Those pictures were also used on all kinds of different outlets, including the covers of the menus for the Awani dining room. So each meal, everybody got their own paper menu that they could take home as a souvenir. And Ansel Adams's pictures were on the cover. These are still for sale on eBay. You can all go home tonight and buy one of your very own to have and to keep. Ansel Adams' picture on it. He wrote the text that accompanied his picture, and you could, at that time, get an envelope from the maitre d' so that you could keep your menu nice and clean. This one is from May 10th, 1936, and you also get to see the fun things they had for breakfast, like pure prune juice, stewed rhubarb, chicken livers sauté on toast with bacon, raisin muffins, and almond buns. So I kind of like that part too. All right, so now we're going to move on to Adams's national parks. We're just a couple more minutes here. We'll wrap up, and then I can take your questions. So in 1941, Ansel Adams was contacted by the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. Here we're seeing Harold Ickes in his Washington, D.C. office. And the reason this picture is so important is what you're seeing on the right-hand side of Ickes' office is a 3-part folding screen, photographic screen by Ansel Adams, that he had made for a 1936 exhibition in Chicago at the Catherine Koo Gallery. And the screen didn't sell, so he sent it on to Harold Ickes, who ultimately purchased it for the Department of Interior. Harold Ickes and Ansel Adams had an ongoing relationship. There's a good label up in the exhibition that talks about Adams's connection with Ickes as a lobbyer for the increase of protected lands in the national parks. And so in 1941, Harold Ickes writes to Adams and says, we have this new Department of Interior building. We're illustrating it with murals, or decorating it with murals. Most of them are paintings, but we think there should be a photographic mural as well. Would you be willing to make a photograph that will be enlarged for presentation in the building? This was like the commission Adams had been waiting for his whole life. He was ready. This brought together all the things that he wanted to do. It was of the national parks, which he felt so committed to. It was for the American people, and it was a large print that was going to be seen in one of the federal buildings, seen by members of Congress, administrators, the members of the public who visited. And so he wrote back and proposed that they actually hire him for a year to photograph all the national parks, and that he could do a whole suite of murals for the Department of Interior building. And he was very persuasive because that's what they did do. They hired him, and he started photographing in October of 1940. And then photographed into 1941. I have that wrong. He started in 41 and photographed into 42. And he photographed all around the western United States and was so taken by this that he really threw himself into the project. And unfortunately, we all know what happened on December 7th, 1941. We entered World War II when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And that entry into World War II meant that the murals that Adams had been hired to do were never produced. So all of those photographs went into the Library of Congress, but they were never printed as large prints until actually the Obama administration, when prints were made for the Department of Interior building. But Adams made pictures like this one as part of that Department of Interior project, and like these two photographs, which are also in the exhibition. And he was so committed to the project that then after he was not able to make the murals, he got Guggenheim funding and did his own extension of the project in 1947 and 1948. And this was really his opportunity to use this new photographic language, this mature style, for the purpose that he had always wanted to talk about the landscape, the wilderness, and the potential for these transformative experiences. And so it all comes together in 1941, and then he just continues to deepen and expand on that photographic language through the rest of his photographic career. And that's a lot of what you see upstairs in the exhibition, are those mature works of the national parks. Okay, so from there I want to wrap up with just one more passage from the book, and no lecture on Ansel Adams would be complete without a discussion of his most famous photograph. Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, 1941. By far, Adams's most famous photograph is Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Oft told, the story of its making is one of photographic legend. The creation of the Moonrise negative happened on a trip when he was accompanied by his son Michael and his friend Cedric Wright. And that's what we're seeing here. This is his 8-year-old son, Michael, on the tailgate of the truck, Cedric Wright in the center, and Ansel Adams standing to the right, and they're packing the truck. They had been making photographs without much success in the Chama River Valley near Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch in northern New Mexico. Driving back to Santa Fe, Adams hastily responded to what he saw before him. Quote, "In the east, the moon was rising over distant clouds and snow peaks, and in the west, the late afternoon sun glanced over a south-flowing cloud bank and blazed a brilliant white upon the crosses in the church cemetery." End quote. He knew he had to act fast. Swerving his station wagon to the side of the road, he commanded his son and Wright to help him set up his 8x10-inch view camera. Tripod, camera body, lens board, lens, dark cloth, loaded film holder, and light meter had to be pulled out and assembled before he could frame and focus the view, made all the more urgent by the rapid descent of the November sun. In the frantic hustle, the light meter could not be found. Evaluating the scene before him, Adams miraculously remembered the luminance of the full moon, 250 candles per square foot, and was able to approximate an exposure for the scene. He released the shutter and captured the clouds, moon, and mountains beyond the little town of Hernandez. Before he could make a second backup negative, the sun dipped below the horizon and the opportunity was gone. With that single negative, Adams preserved a view that has become a photographic icon. The image at its core exhibits many of his mature stylistic elements. Adams filled the frame with a vast expanse of sky, the moon hovering above a bank of horizontally striated clouds, and a long, low chain of mountains. He placed the chapel and cross-filled graveyard of Hernandez in the middle ground, bounded by a shrub-filled plain. The picture features a panoramic sweep of landscape and compellingly asserts that this perspective, with its precise arrangement of human edifice within a monumental and impressive environment, is the critical viewpoint for observing the scene. The drama comes, in part, from the relative scale of the elements. The endless quality of the sky reminds viewers of how small and seemingly insignificant we are in the expanse of the universe. All of these visual qualities serve to inspire in the viewer a sense of awe in the face of a spectacular and unique visual experience, an appreciation for the natural scene, and a feeling of amazement. Unlike the mountain pictures of the late 1920s and 30s found in his Permeant Prints portfolio or his Sierra Club album, Moonrise clearly conveys Adams's intensity of experience, his message about the transcendental possibilities for people when they are immersed in nature, and his deep appreciation for the American landscape. This slide compares his final print to his proof print. The proof print's on the right. The proof print is a straight or unaltered printing from the negative with no darkroom work, such as dodging or burning, that allows the manipulation of exposure to select areas of a print. As such, it affords a view of Hernandez that is much closer to the one Adams originally observed, albeit in black and white. From this view of the landscape, he envisioned, or to use his parlance, visualized the finished artwork of Moonrise Hernandez, New Mexico. Moonrise existed only in his imagination. He photographed a raw scene that he could transform in the darkroom into a symbol that would convey how he felt under a vast and beautiful New Mexico sky. By altering the relationship of the sky and the graveyard of the Hernandez Chapel to create a dark expanse over a shimmering village burial ground, Adams created from the raw material of the landscape an emotionally engaging image, one that borders on magic or mysticism. On that November day, Adams drew on more than 2 decades of wilderness exploration and photographic experience to create what would become his masterpiece. Deep and repeated contemplation had etched in him the value and meaning of immersing oneself in nature. Equally ingrained were lessons about making photographs that effectively convey an essential idea. Adams's early years had readied him for the scene he discovered along the highway as the sun set over northern New Mexico. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has questions. Okay, go right ahead.
After 17 years of this amazing journey that you have been on, are you continuing into Ansel Adams, or are you resting, or are you going forward with a new project?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that there's more interesting stuff to be done on Ansel Adams. I'd really like to work on his workshops. So starting in 1940, Ansel Adams taught workshops that were open to anyone. Any member of the public could come to Yosemite and study with Adams. He wasn't the only instructor. He had people like Dorothea Lange and Edward Weston and Roy DeCarava and Jerry Uelsman and Robert Heineken and Olivia Parker. I mean, amazing photographers. It's like if Warhol invited people to come to the factory and learn how to make silkscreens, right? I mean, artists don't do that. So I think that would be really interesting. And I think there are still lots of people. There may even be someone in this very room, there goes the hand, people who were at those Ansel Adams workshops, right? So it's still possible to interview people who had those experiences, could tell us what they were like. So I think I probably will start that research. That said, I think that part of what we have all had made abundantly clear to us in the last year and a half is that white artists have had plenty of attention, and it's time to make space for other artists to have attention too. So perhaps it'll take me 17 years to write the next book, and by then we'll be ready for another Ansel Adams book, but I think for now it's time to really share the stage with lots of other photographers who are making great work too. Yeah.
The title of your book includes the word early. What percentage or what portion of his career is covered in your book?
So Ansel Adams was born in 1902. He lived to 1984. And my book covers 1916, when he was a 14-year-old, up to and through the 1940s. So I'm looking at the whole period where he's working in this earlier style up until he hits his mature style. And showing that progress from those early ways of working into his the style that we know. And it's actually where he begins to make many of his most famous pictures. So it's like the first half of his working life.
I took the class in 1979. And the other teachers were Barbara Crane and Ann Noggle. So it was, talk about different.
That's super cool.
These are two photographers, women to start with, and then doing work that's absolutely 180 degrees from that.
Right.
And so the classes were really very interesting. There's some of it I do remember better than others. The most interesting part was he was a small man, and it was in the transition of, he was, yes, it was 5-6 years before he died. And Alan Ross was leaving as his assistant, and John Sexton was coming in, which also had different styles in terms of what they were doing. But we would go out with Ansel in the field, sort of tromping around, and he had a little Polaroid camera, and he would take a picture, and the two of them would like crowd around him to take all the shreds of the photographs, because nobody could have them otherwise. They had had problems with people taking stuff from the darkroom garbage cans and authenticating pictures and all of that. But he referred to himself more as a scientist. I mean, the way he talked about it, you talk about the emotion and all of that. What I see in his photographs is the selling. I mean, he's trying to get people to believe what he believes in. But he never really talked about subject matter or, the content and emotions and all of that. He talked about, his big thing was you learn the science, the zone system, which I couldn't figure out, and I don't think most of the people there could figure it out either. But his thing was, you're the scientist, and you learn it to forget it. And that's what frees you up to do these kinds of photographs. And that's what I got out of it more than anything else. He was very famous at that point. He had, and the big sales that came afterwards in California, the $100,000 prints and all of that stuff was all happening. They were reprinting some things and destroying other stuff. Negatives, there were stories that they were, that the assistants, they would do a portfolio and then they would take the negatives and put them through a check canceling machine to destroy them. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that was what everyone was thinking. So it was a really transformative time for him too, but it was an amazing experience. And it wasn't a big class.
Right,
It was small, and the two people that taught took the place of Arnold Newman, who was supposed to be there, but he couldn't go. So no matter who you went to see, it was a bonus. It was a fabulous experience.
Okay, so after the talk, give me your email address, and I'll put you on my list. It's fascinating, right, that Ansel Adams was inviting people to come do this. Really cool. Yeah.
Thank you for that amazing talk. Something I've always been curious about is just the term Permeant Prints, and they're such special objects. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little more about those, and also the status of photography like at that time.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. So Permeant Print is a made-up word. There's lots of, I did all the research. It's pretty hard to say exactly where the term came from, but there wasn't much of a market for photographs in that moment, and especially on the West Coast, there was not a market for photographs. On the East Coast, Alfred Stieglitz had been selling photographs at an American Place. There was something of an understanding that you might buy a photograph, but much less so on the West Coast. And Adams was very green. He was 25 years old, and this patron came along and offered to help him. And so they connected up with a publisher, and it was the publisher who really felt like packaging them like a portfolio of prints would help patrons and other purchasers get what it was. It was a portfolio of prints, and that was something everybody understood. So the idea was that if you called them Permeant Prints, they'd have a kind of model for what they were investing in. The paper that Adams is using at this period is this translucent paper, and it looked almost like an etching or like a print, and you can see that when you see the prints upstairs. Or for those people who know photography, they look a little bit like platinum prints. They're not, I can get into more detail about this, but they're not coated with baryta, so the paper that keeps the paper translucent, but it also means that the highlights of the paper are the highlights of the photographic print, more like with a print, a work on paper. So this was all an attempt to create something that was marketable, that you could package. And part of the argument that I make in the book, believe it or not, there's more in the book than what you heard tonight. the idea is that he's thinking about audience, that when he starts his career, he doesn't know how to think about audience. But part of what made him so incredibly successful is that he consciously develops a sense of who he's making the picture for. And as that gets more and more sophisticated, he gets better and better at making pictures for a broad audience. And when he hits his stride is when he does that National Parks project for the federal government. So now he's thinking about the biggest possible audience and how to communicate through photography to that audience. So we see in this arc of him going from that childhood album to the national parks, learning about audiences that keep getting a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and then a lot bigger and then really big, and he gets more and more successful with each one. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
I think actually we're just on time. We may have time for just like one more really fast question.
Yeah,
and
everybody was just getting warmed up. There are like 6
but we gotta
hands
get you
now.
over to the book signing, but
Yes.
maybe
I have a question right here.
Okay.
I went to school in 1979 to learn photography. I was great to be taught by one of the best schools in the country, the United States Navy, in Pensacola, Florida. At least so I've heard lately. I studied Ansel Adams and a few others. And of your experience, I want to pass this on to my kids and friends who are starting to get interested in photography. And with the digital age, it's kind of hard to teach chemistry. So what book would you recommend as far as, okay, I've read the camera, the negative, and the print.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually rereading them now. Which would you recommend of all of his publications to teach our young kids today what it's like to actually take a photograph rather than take a picture?
Yeah, oh, that's such a nice question. So there is a John Schaefer version of the Ansel Adams technical manuals that's intended to be, you're nodding, so you know it, it's intended to be a little less, it was intended to be more accessible. But in terms of inspiring people to think about picture making, there's a book Adams did in the very last year of his life. It's called Examples, The Making of 40 Photographs. And it's anecdotal. Sometimes he talks about the technical things. Sometimes he talks about the conditions of making the picture or the, framing and setting up the camera. But I think it's a really beautiful book for getting in his head. It's like you're sitting next to him on the couch and hearing the stories of how he made the pictures. And I feel like that really helps you think about who he is as a photographer. And it definitely gets at the technical things, but it also, I think, really helps bring you into what he was thinking. A lovely last question. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and I'm happy to sign books if you're interested. Thank you.